Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. I've added one more topic to the agenda, but maybe we can discuss this later and start with the provisioning requests which have been there before. I see you've added some points, Jonathan. We also have Marcin who has more context on provisioning requests than I do. So I'm not sure who wants to start. Do you want to have your points, mention your points, Jonathan, or Marcin? Do you want to maybe give some context on this?
Yeah, sure. I can start. So, what's the story behind provisioning request? So, we merged the CAP about 9 months ago, and at the time of CAP merging, we were already in alpha internally at Google. With a slightly different API. So, early access program for provisioning requests at Google started around June last year. By August, we already gathered feedback from early access program customers, and based on this feedback, we created the proposal and the API. The API was reviewed by official Kubernetes reviewer Jordan Ligit, uh, even though it is in K8s-X domain, so it wasn't required. We wanted to make sure that the API follows all of the Kubernetes standards. From September, maybe October, and the API was available at publicly on GKE, and we were starting working on upstreaming it to cluster autoscaler. So the API was there since October. It was in production for and used by multiple customers. They gave us private testimony, and they also did joint talks with us on Google conference, GCP Next, explaining how they are using it and what difference it makes for them. I can share the links. It was the talk by us and Two Sigma, like a major investment firm from New York. Maybe you've heard about it. So right now, the API, at least in my opinion, is quite tested, and it received positive feedback from multiple independent entities. So from that perspective, it already proved its point. It already was validated. So my proposal is to go with this API in beta in Cluster Autoscaler, because the main goal of Alpha API is to prove that the idea works and that it is a needed feature. We have been already doing it for almost a year, if you include early access program at Google, and the API has public approval from other entities. So I'm not sure if I see point in going with it in alpha in Cluster Autoscaler. So as I said, in GKE, we have this API tested. It's in beta, and we wanted to upstream it based on the feedback that we received, and that's why the proposal is to go with alpha based on numerous positive feedback that we received so far. Doing beta at Cluster Autoscaler doesn't close options to change the API as needed. It just proved that it is not like some experiment that we can close at any time. It's just like it's something relatively solid. So that's why the proposal is to go with beta. So if you have any comments, they can be addressed with, I know, beta 2 if needed, or if they are relatively minor, if and when we graduate the API to GA.
Also, thank you for your hand raised.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure the procedure. I think from our side, and as I've been absent from a bunch of these discussions, apologize for that. We did a bunch of alignment work between Cass and Carpenter in the fall. And I think the resounding answer was like, if there's something that makes sense to live in both projects and it's net new, we should figure out how to make sure that that's kind of the right, that's a common interface for customers, regardless of their auto-scaling tech. And I think that the risk here is that if we kind of go one direction and it makes less sense for the Carpenter customer base, and I know that you've validated it with like this Google Early Access program. I think that the core discussion here is like whether or not we're on the right trajectory to getting to an aligned solution, or whether or not we're kind of on a diverging trajectory. And I'm sure every beta API promotion is different, but I see beta as it's not that you can't walk back a beta, but it's a very strong communication to customers around adoption. And what you ultimately end up getting is a lot more adoption. And I think that's why you're trying to promote to beta. But if we think that there's potentially major use cases that aren't addressed that might require significant breaking changes to the API, naming changes, conceptual changes, maybe we need two APIs. I think we haven't, I don't know what Jonathan's thinking on these things. I have a bunch of opinions, but that if you do go through that promotion, it makes it a lot harder to walk back. And a beta 2 is going to impact more customers. So we kind of have to trade off that kind of short term, all the customers that might feel more comfortable adopting this beta versus the impact to those customers if we get them to adopt and then decide actually we did the alignment work after beta and then we have to go do a beta 2. I think that's the biggest thing I would think about, at least for Carpenter customers. I don't know how, like if there's plans to be like publicly available in GKE, that one would be, I don't know what the versioning policy is there for GKE.
We also do have a deprecation policy, so we will not be changing it. That's the last question. One additional context, the cap was publicly reviewed by the community back in September, and during the alignment talks, I mentioned this API on multiple times, and I even mentioned it on the talk I gave back in Chicago last year in November. So everyone who could have concerns about possible implications on Carpenter could have expressed it already. So we let you know, and you left the comments on the doc back in September. So I'm not exactly sure what approach we should take at this moment, because it's been almost a year since this proposal was there, and we are progressing. And yeah, I understand that there might be some changes that needs to be made to the API for it to match to Carpenter, but we gave all of the possible opportunities to express these concerns. And so far there wasn't many of them. And because of that, I think that we could consider actually moving forward with beta. As I said, it's not GA. We can change it. It has been validated. Customers spoke about it on conferences. So I spoke on conferences. So all of the formal aspects have been met. If you have any strong comments right now, I think we could discuss it, and based on it decide if it's like a totally no-go because X, Y, and Z are not addressed, and there is no way we could address them in the future. If you have these use cases, then yeah, that's a more material thing that we could discuss. I would rather not go back on alpha based on I'm not exactly sure what exactly, because from the former perspective, all of the things have been met to a large extent.
So if
Like
I
there
may,
was,
sorry.
yeah, sure.
So specifically to Ellie's point, right? I think the risk is because I don't think there is any realistic chance or expectation by anyone, and please correct me, of Carpenter supporting this in like 130 kind of time frame anyway. So the risk you describe of beta 2 being breaking is there potentially, but it's essentially a CAS specific risk, just because realistically beta 1 would only happen in CAS, I assume, unless we do all of the discussion and decide this is actually the final API we want, in which case at some point whenever you have capacity, right, we can bring this into Carpenter. But I think that risk is primarily on the CAS side. And yeah, I think as Martin mentioned, like sort of going forward, this is ideally not how we should be doing those things, but there is this historical context of this essentially happening before all the alignment, right, that Martin just described.
Or during the alignment, like if we could get to the nodes, then yeah, it was mentioned. I let you know multiple times that this thing is coming.
Yeah, I mean, we've been quite aware. I think it's even on. So we track a parallel issue called manual node provisioning in Carpenter. It's our most upvoted project or upvoted issue in the entire project, just to give some sense of what customers are asking more. I think nobody would deny that this is a really important feature. I think that there's just some realities of there's only so many things you can do at once, and we were really focused on getting the alignment work done correctly, and just there's only so much bandwidth on the team, and yeah, and given more resources, more time, I would have loved to catch this on the first boat. And you know, if ultimately, I think the only concern that I have is that we would get to a beta and then say, well, it meets customers' needs, and now we're in beta, so we're going to go to B1. And I think if we can all agree that if the Carpenter team kind of engages on this issue over the next couple of months, and maybe we can define a time frame for that. And if we decide that there's API changes that must be breaking, which I think is just a totally open question to me. I don't know whether or not we can embed them into the existing API or not. That we would then, if SIG Autoscaling would be comfortable making the beta 2 and getting some sort of commitment to that in the spirit of aligning for both projects. Fabulous. I'm great.
Yeah, I think that's beta 2. If there is a need, is totally okay. Beta is also like a way of getting feedback from the user. It's a little bit of chicken and egg problem. So until we commit, the users will not commit, and until if users don't commit, they will not give us feedback. So staying in alpha has this risk that nobody will take this API seriously, and nobody will integrate it with it, and we will not get feedback, and we will not be able to promote it to beta. So there is some amount of informed risk in it. Like we we bet that this API is reasonable. We checked previous version. We did everything that we realistically could, like including early version to the customers, reviewing it with Jordan Liggett and so on. So yeah, that's what we think is reasonable API. But if you or the customers or whoever decides that this API needs expansion or some changes, then yeah, I think that beta 2 is totally okay, and we will do beta 2 based on these needs, feedbacks from both you and customers.
Totally. Do we want to maybe spend, Jonathan, do you have any concerns on top of this?
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered the ones I had. As long as we have feedback period, I think to Elsa's point, I think yeah, we we were looking at it to some degree, but I do think that there was a little bit of the reality of like I don't think anyone was like seriously thinking about it on the Carpenter side, and now we're kind of at a point where we maybe have the extra time to really think about all these use cases and problems associated with this. And I think we just want to make sure we're doing like the adequate work on our side that says, okay, here's how we think about it. Does that match up with, or are there ways that that's close enough to how Cass thinks about this? Or are there potentially things and use cases or changes that we'd like to see in Cass? And I don't think anyone has really done a ton of that work on our side. So as long as we have like the appropriate amount of time to be able to do that work before things stabilize, I think that's my biggest concern.
Okay. So as I said, we are not putting GA stamp on it. It's just beta at this moment. But yeah, eventually we would like to graduate it to GA. So some amount of thinking on your side would be required on your feature so that this API also works for your use cases.
Do we want to maybe like theorize a date on when we would, so let's say we go to beta this afternoon. I know it's going to take longer than that, but how long would you want that beta period to be? Like if we drop off the face of the earth, you can't stop making progress, right? So when is that kind of, how long do you want that period to be? When do we need to have a response?
As long as you are comfortable with you. As I said, the API was on Google side since October, and we are quite confident in it. So if that was only for me, I could graduate the API itself, not the implementation, because the implementation is provider specific and so on. API probably today, but I don't want to do it. We don't have implementation for full implementation in open source. So from that perspective, the graduation to GA today will not happen, and it is totally inappropriate. So my idea was to graduate to API to GA once we have sufficient feedback from the open source cluster autoscaler implementation. From that perspective, it's probably like a period no shorter than 3 months after we release cluster autoscaler, which it has the implementation in it. Like, so we haven't completed the implementation. So the earliest totally hypothetical date is at least 4 months in the future.
So essentially looking at like the beginning of Q4 in September, maybe?
Yeah, something like that. But
Or sorry, that's October 1.
May, June, July, August, like September. September would be the earliest date, hypothetically, when we could claim that someone tested the implementation in cluster autoscaler, deployed it, and gave reasonable positive feedback based on the open source. As I said, in GK, we had it well before, but we are talking about open source only right now. That gives you at least 4 months to think about whether this API works for you, or you would request changes. However, it would be great if we could get some feedback earlier, so that the new, if for example beta 2 is needed, then the works on it could happen earlier. So essentially, the earliest you could give us the feedback, especially if you don't like the API and you think that it should be done totally differently, then the sooner the better, because then we can start coding it, start changing it, and deploy the new version as soon as possible to get the feedback on the new version. If you are okay with the API and it fits your needs, then that's fine. And then we could start discussing what are the actual graduation criteria. I doubt that we will meet all of them in early September, like September the 1st. So realistically, we are talking about October-ish, November-ish timeframe. If we want to be proper on the feedback, proper on the review, and all stuff, then we are talking about graduation to GA sometime, I don't know, mid-October, let's say.
Yes, like KubeCon NA timing.
Yes, something
Maybe
like
the
that.
SIG doesn't release around conferences, but the so yeah, I think we definitely need to dig in on this, Jonathan. We need to figure out and maybe even just in a minute we can describe like the other use cases we think aren't being met. But I think we need to dig in on this. Timing is definitely important, right? Because like you can't collaborate on something and just have something never make progress, right? We need to make progress on this. The kind of criteria from the Carpenter side, I think, is making sure that we're meeting the like laundry list of use cases. And some of those may be in Carpenter specific APIs and some of them may be in shared APIs. I think we need to figure out what that split is. And then have a trial period with customers. And then obviously you would know our approach after the first step once we knew what we were doing. And then there'd be some period of time when we were exploring an alpha API with our customers, or maybe if we decide, the provisioning request API is exactly what we need, we would just trial that beta with our customers. But I think there's kind of a similar feedback loop we're trying to get. We're just behind, right? We don't know what we want to do from a design perspective. And then we also would need to get an implementation out, and then you can start the feedback period. So I'm hopeful we can at least get some signal by October of whether or not we think we're going to need more time. Like we as the SIG will need more time to align these things. It seems reasonable to me that if we can't sort ourselves out by then, that seems like a good amount of time. But I also suspect that well, just from your side, if we did decide that by October that there were some use cases not being met, that you're not wedded to that October date at all for a GA. Like you don't have to or anything.
No, we don't have any legal commitments at this moment to graduate it by October. We want to be just reasonable. So if some use cases are totally not possible with the API, then we will either change the API or we'll introduce slightly different API for those use cases. So there are like two options there.
Yeah.
But again, I would rather like to learn about potential problems. I don't know, June 1st, not October 1st.
Yeah.
Because October 1st is the date when we hopefully should be ready to put the stamp on it as GA, not the moment where we start thinking, what the hell are we doing with the API?
So on the technicals and the use cases, there's customers have given us so much feedback on this thread that I linked. And we've just had a lot of conversations about this problem. There's kind of two schools of thought, I think, in terms of over provisioning. One is whether or not you're modeling things as pods, and one is whether or not you're modeling them as nodes. And maybe the answer is we actually need both. We both need, and with with CAS, you have autoscaling groups, and so it's actually straightforward to model things as nodes. And so if you have provisioning requests, then you can model things as pods, or you can just model things as like as a node group on its own and not attach CAS to it, and then you have that scaler there. So there's kind of those two dimensions of modeling excess compute, and I think they're different for different use cases. Like for use cases that are leveraging bin packing less, maybe it's an ML use case, it's using the GPU, it's like one pod per node, that kind of thing. Or there's a more static relationship. It's a box with 8 GPUs, you know you're going to have 8 pods. It's much easier for operators to do the math on how much over provisioning they need. And it's in many cases simpler to reason about it in terms of nodes. Of course, when you're thinking in terms of pods, you can do things like topology and affinity and all of the power of the pod spec, resources, bin packing, etc. So that's kind of useful and interesting as well. It may be that in Carpenter, we need to model the node over provisioning as a Carpenter specific thing, and then the pod over provisioning, we're sharing the provisioning request. That was kind of what I was referring to as maybe some of the use cases are met in different ways.
Yes, nodes are totally not represented in the API. That's on purpose.
Yeah.
So if you had a need for node provisioning requests, we could create node provisioning requests, and then you would be operating not in terms of pods, but in terms of, I don't know, node requirements for providing stuff for pods. To be honest, you cannot do things significantly different because you need to provide like pod spec and the number of pods, and that's basically what is in the API. So like a pod template, number of pods, and arbitrary string that denotes what type of provisioning you want to have. So from pod perspective, anything can fit in it, and the response is provided also in conditions that could be extended arbitrarily. So just guessing here, most of the pod centric use cases would be covered by the API. Nodes obviously are not covered, but these will have totally different API. So probably that will be a separate object, not necessarily the very same one.
Yeah, and Carpenter actually has an API for a request for a node right now. It's called a node claim.
So if you don't mind, right? I'm curious in terms of doing node requests and understanding the use case. If you have a node pool which has instances of different sizes, right? The node count itself is not. I mean, you request 5 nodes, you may end up with 5 CPUs or 50 CPUs. So I'm curious how that goes. Is the expectation basically that for those use cases, you just create node pools that have very narrow specification of what type of node you want? Or is the use case more that, okay, I just want out of this large collection of that I have in my node pool, I just want 50 CPUs, right? And then like how this is distributed between VMs. I guess you can model this with pods, obviously, but you could you could also say that writing I want 50 CPUs is slightly easier and more convenient than writing 50 pod specs of one CPU. Even though the latter is obviously more correct in the sense that you get guarantees in terms of fragmentation and affinities and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely nail on the head there. One way we've been thinking about it is just simply a replicas field in the node pool Carpenter API, and it looks very like a node group, or I guess they are like you now have kind of two modes on Carpenter node pools. One is Carpenter figures out how many and what size and all the details, or the user tells us. So you could almost imagine that replicas field being a number or automatic, right? And that's how you would drive that. And then the problem you stated, of course, like if you have diversely sized instance types, you have to assume the minimum size, and probably any user configuring this would want to have similarly sized instance types. There's maybe some flexibility use cases where, base spot markets or whatever could actually have the larger instance types be the same price. That's kind of one line of thinking I think we need to explore. And maybe that's just fully in the Carpenter ecosystem and not outside. We're really motivated by using Carpenter's lifecycle management capabilities. So upgrading nodes, expiring nodes, spot interruption handling, all of the stuff that we do in Carpenter that's not auto scaling. We want to make sure that we can land all those features for this manual mode, so to speak. But yeah, like you said, the sizing, the dynamism of the sizing that Carpenter has today, that would change essentially the second that you try to model things in terms of nodes. The second dimension, I think that one's almost like more well known to us. The second dimension of complexity around manual node provisioning or provisioning requests is around how customers specify it. So right now, with the current API and the negative preemption pod approach, you're basically saying like it's an overhead. It's like always leave this amount of room. If it gets used, they just bubble up and make more capacity. And so you always it's kind of like a headroom concept. And we've heard a bunch of different things from customers about this. One is around proportional headroom. So I want to have 10% extra CPUs in my cluster. And maybe this is as simple as that replica field is like actually just like a resources block, and it's an interstring, so you can say percent or concrete value. I don't know how that evolves, but being able to capture the proportional use case, I think is really, like, lots of customers have told us about that. And the other one is around a floor. So we have kind of like this ceiling, but also having if all my pods go away, like I don't want to maintain a ceiling. I don't want to pay for that extra ceiling, but I do want a floor where if like my whole cluster empties, I don't want to hit a total cold start on Monday morning when all my business's workloads are starting up again. And so there's kind of, I don't know, Jonathan, is that a total representation of what we've heard so far? Is there's like a floor concept, a ceiling concept, flat concept, a proportional concept, and then a pod concept and a node concept? And what are all the combinations of those things?
I mean, there's the pre-warm, but then like the pre-warm, like how do you represent that warming as you go, right? Like I think there's like I want a 4, but then I also want like it to continue to scale with me up to a point, which maybe is too complex to represent. Like as like you're actually utilizing that capacity, I want it to be like warm because I know what the like total size of my capacity was going to be. So as I scale up, I like keep having it, and maybe it reduces over time in like a, I don't know, logarithmic way or something like that. And then there's like the use case that I understand the provisioning request to be addressing, which is I want to just like pre-provision the capacity, and then once the capacity is there, I just completely utilize and like use up the capacity, which is a little bit different than headroom. They're like completely different use cases, and it's almost like a gang scheduling based use case. So this was, I think this is my feedback last week. I think we need to do thinking on our side and like all the different ways that like I want to like get all the use cases and then figure out like which of these use case, like I was saying, like which of these use cases this API addresses, and then which of them that we're maybe missing, and if those need to be the same API. Like I think our gut feeling is that they probably do like need to probably be related because they are similar-ish. But I don't think we've done enough thinking to really understand like if they are. But that was my, I guess my biggest concern was like, okay, how can we extend this API if it needs to be extended? Because it feels like natural that like this is like close to a headroom concept. So potentially it needs to be like there needs to be thinking around whether this also applies to headroom beyond just like atomic scale ups and like using up the capacity itself. Because it is more of just like it's like pre-provisioning, but also, and pre-provisioning covers like a bunch of different things. I think my other thought, and I was curious, Marcin, just because I didn't see this in the doc, is like what is there like documentation of discussion between like SIG scheduling and SIG serving around, or maybe not SIG serving, SIG batch, but now there is SIG serving around these kinds of like utilizations of CAS for this kind of concept? Like what's the feedback been from like across the other SIGs on this provisioning request API?
From SIG batch, so maybe what was the main use case? So the main use case was to have something like gang scheduling with autoscaling, because scheduler doesn't know what could come hypothetically in the cluster, so it is unable to perform any gang scheduling for the clusters that have variable number of nodes, or that nodes can be requested as needed. So from that perspective, scheduler itself is a bit helpless. So autoscaler one way or another is needed. From SIG batch, there was, this is the main customer Q, which is the project owned by SIG batch, is already using it, is already integrated with provisioning request, and it is like the main driving force behind it. So batch working group and Q is driving the feature. So yeah. From that, we are in talks. The API was presented. There it was also mentioned during batch working group updates, and it's already integrated with Q since also like September last year. So so far so good. In terms of API, yeah, it is for very specific set of pods. So if you provide pod template, you already know what are the requests. So it's not like give me 20% headroom. It's a totally different thing. It's just provide me space for this set of pods. You could essentially get something similar like headroom if you provide generic pods and you specify like a class that provides it all the time and can make sure that this space for this specific set of pods is always there. So this is kind of supported by the API, but it may not be exactly what you want. What you are saying is, I want to have 20% extra CPU in my cluster. Not necessarily I want to have space for 20 pods of this particular and specific shape, right? And that would be a different API focus on nodes and node capabilities and all of the things that you have in configuring the number of nodes and the shape of the nodes, rather than on pods. If you need to provide a specific pod via pod template, then any generic work that provides like not specific pods is kind of abusing the API already. You are not needing the space for this particular pod. You're just trying to get something that you want with the tool that is currently available, which is not perfect for the use case of 20% of extra CPU headroom. So what you are saying is probably a slightly different API. It could still sit in the same API group, but it should focus on the nodes and, for example, provide me 5 extra clones of this type of nodes, rather than provide me space for pods with this specific node selector, affinity sets, and GPUs and image, right?
Yeah, totally. On the headroom piece, so as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong in my understanding of how this like came to be. My understanding of like this whole like the use case for the provisioning request API in general is the queue use case, which is the gang scheduling, like pre-provisioned, like I need to like pre-schedule capacity, make sure it's fully up, make sure my jobs can run, let the jobs run, and that, well, and if they can't schedule, then obviously like spin down the capacity, maybe try again. And then once they're able to run to completion, spin down the capacity, and I don't care about that provisioning request anymore. Is the headroom, and then it was kind of written aspirationally with like the headroom use case as like a potential extension of that idea.
You could have a headroom if you can express it in pods.
Right.
If
Totally.
your headroom is expressible in pods, then yes, you can have a provisioning class, then keeps all the time monitoring whether there is enough headroom for these specific pods. It works if, for example, you need to have a space for 20 notebooks for your ML researchers, and you want this space to be always available, and the notebooks are of the same shape, right?
Right.
And
Yeah,
then it's very specific job, because you don't know which ML researcher will start its workload. You just want to have 20 slots for Jupyter to be available all of the time, so that the researchers, if they have a great idea over lunch, then they can immediately start coding, right? And then you can express it in slots, pods, whatever. And each of the slots is of the shape of the pods, and autoscaler makes sure that these slots are available. So this is slightly different headroom, very, very specific headroom that is available with this API. However, if you want to have generic capacity headroom, not necessary for notebooks, but for anything that could request some amount of CPU or some amount of GPUs, then you could express it with the API, but that will be kind of abuse of the pod-centric API. You probably want to express it with some different abstractions than specific pods. You can. For ages, we have been recommending balloon pods in cluster autoscaler to get things. However, that's kind of hack or abuse of the API. And if you want to have a proper API, then it's for headroom expressible in percentage of CPU in the cluster, then that's a different API, not the provisioning request as we have it. And if we try to expand provisioning request to cover nodes, then it would have a huge OR in it in the API. And if you have OR in the API, then it means that there are two different APIs, basically.
Yeah, I don't think that what I'm asking is not to suggest that like this API should also extend to nodes. Like I think that we can perhaps I think we'll do thinking on it, but I think we can perhaps decouple those, because I agree with you that like the representation of those things are quite different and maybe don't apply to both projects. Like you already kind of have this like yeah, I don't know. Maybe there is like a headroom concept for CAS as well, in the concept of nodes. I don't quite know. But anyway, I do want to kind of decouple those things. I think my main reason for asking the question was if we have like if the use case that provisioning request was meant to meet was like solely like the gang scheduling use case, I want to pre-provision my capacity and like make sure that all those pods can schedule when they come up, or if it was also like there were specific use cases around headroom, or if it was just like aspirationally like, oh, we have this thing, it probably also works for headroom, but like we don't know. Like I'm curious if we have people that are using this for headroom right now, or if it's literally just for gang scheduling. That's the main thing we're trying to attack.
Currently, the API is mainly used for gang scheduling. It could be done for specific pod provisioning. However, we don't have implementation for this yet. It is not there. It's possible. We think it through, but that wasn't the main thing the customers were asking. It could be done currently with balloon pods in cluster autoscaler, and I guess balloon pods also work in similar fashion in Carpenter. And provisioning request is mainly focused on like provisioning the whole capacity, not and maybe maintaining this capacity, but the main reason is to give you 20. If you ask for 20 slots, we will only give you thumbs up if there are 20 slots. For headroom, 90 out of 20 is probably also okay-ish to a large extent. Maybe 15 out of 20 is also okay-ish, and then it's a slightly different thing than yes and no conditions. So the API could be used for it. It's generic enough for it to be done. Right now, there is no such use in the wild.
Yeah, but I mean, sort of conceptually on this, right? I think since you essentially have the three things the API has is a pod spec, number of replicas, and a way for pod to mark that it's consuming the API. So really, we could just add a provisioning class that is kind of not related to any of this atomicity or all or nothing gang scheduling thing. Just basically say headroom mode, and that would essentially or should be able to cover anything you could do with balloon pods today, right? Because this is at the end of the day, it's basically just balloon pods except expressed in the form of CRD, which I think I don't know about exact implementation in Carpenter, but it comes with certain benefits, even if you use it that way, compared to balloon pods. Namely, that there is no need to actually do preemption in scheduler, which we've seen that in large enough clusters that can be a performance issue. Scheduler is not that good at preempting pods in a large volume. And also, just because you submit one CRD, you don't have this problem of autoscaler making, at least in CAS, like autoscaling making partial decisions because like you want 10,000 balloon pods and they just keep creating. We just see them all in one go so we can make better decisions. So I think even in this use case, it has a lot of benefits, and it could be very easily extended just by adding provisioning class, probably without any further changes to API. But I also wanted to quickly mention that on this node use case, as much as I agree it may be a separate use case, I think I'd be quite interested in discussing this also from CAS perspective. Like it may be that it's specific to Carpenter, but I'm not entirely sure it needs to be. I think we've also had this user request for like 20% extra capacity and so on. I think the challenges are similar, and I think there is like there aren't that many easy answers in CAS, because even though CAS has those homogeneous node groups, it's still the usual way of running it is to have a lot of them. So you don't want to go and express your headroom on every node group separately in most cases. You just want a headroom that is some number of nodes. So I think there is actually potentially a lot of similarities and I think similar challenges, right? Like 20% of nodes may be fine for one pod per node, but 20% of nodes as extra capacity, I don't think it works, because what happens is, does that mean I need 20% of completely extra nodes? The default scheduler policy is to spread pods around, right? So I can have almost empty pods and I just keep adding more. It's actually not entirely trivial. And so this is something we've been thinking about for a long time, how to do this. So I think, maybe we end up with different APIs because there is too much difference between Carpenter and CAS, but I'd very much like to start the discussion on maybe we have two APIs, but they are still two shared APIs.
Yeah, I think I actually want to dig more into what Ellis was saying earlier. I'll have to talk with him offline because I'm not fully convinced that we need a node representation, but I also I don't think I'm as deep as he is on some of like the node use cases, because I agree. I think it gets kind of tricky when it comes to like figuring out whether pods can actually even schedule the nodes that you pre-spin. Maybe it's I guess probably it's more useful in the case of like an admin team that doesn't truly understand like the workloads or doesn't care and just wants like some capacity there that they believe could schedule like generic workloads, and therefore it doesn't matter like what the shape of those nodes actually looks like, or it maybe matters at a high level in terms of like total resources, but like doesn't actually matter. Fundamentally, like they're not tied to the application. I guess that's the only like use case I can really think of. But I think just to like make sure we have like the right, I guess, direction based on the discussion that we have today. It sounds like, I just want to summarize, like it sounds like we're saying, okay, 130 for y'all is like it's reasonable to take a beta so that we can get more adoption or that CAS can get more adoption over and usage out of this API and get more feedback. With the caveat of like we're going to do work on our side to make sure that we like properly like vet out the use cases that are being covered by this API and think through like exactly how we would approach the problem, and whether this API meets those use cases that in Carpenter, and have some feedback period. I think with the hard end date being October, but like realistically, like an aspirational date for that would be something like July. I'm curious if like it makes sense to continue to have like working sessions. Like Maciek, I don't like, to me these conversations are valuable. like having discussions about the specific problem is valuable. I also wonder if I know we talked a little bit about like some of the cross SIG discussion over the use cases like gang scheduling. I was trying to dig into that a little bit earlier. I'm not sure how much, like to what extent that's happened because I wasn't involved in those discussions, like with SIG batch or SIG scheduling around some of these things. I would be interested to see if we can like attend some of their working group sessions and like talk about these use cases and see how they're thinking about them and see if there's any like cross SIG collaboration that needs to happen around like things like gang scheduling are the ones I'm specifically thinking of because like I guarantee you that Keep Scheduler and SIG scheduling cares about that, obviously.
Yeah, there is some prior work in SIG scheduling, though it's at least from cluster autoscaler perspective, quite incompatible with how CAS work. But yeah, that's interesting topic. And broadly speaking, I find those sessions very useful. So even for the topic of like those over provisioning APIs, there is clearly a lot of thoughts to be had. I think this is something where we're also looking at broader over provisioning topics. It's something we are looking on CAS side. It seems to be something you are looking on. Maybe we can regroup for a few weeks. I don't know, whatever time we need in 2-3 weeks when we kind of had a chance to think things through. I'd love a kind of more in-depth technical discussion on where we're going with this and yeah, sharing
Yeah,
some.
I think similar to DRA maybe to some extent, like a proposal for like some sort of like working, just like play with it POC might be useful. Not for users to use on Carpenter's side, but just for people to build and like start toying with. Even just like potentially using the provisioning request API and just seeing like how it functions with Carpenter and if it can even meet some of these use cases. Yeah, but I think that I agree. I think we definitely need to do some offline thinking, and I think part of the problem is like resourcing, unfortunately, like we've talked about before. But then I do think like a regrouping after a couple weeks and like having some sort of like fixed cadence to have this discussion, or 3 weeks to have this discussion on provisioning requests and over provisioning APIs makes sense. Because we'll like do some thinking on our side, have thoughts, and then come back. And I think having these discussions seems to be pretty valuable to like making progress on this topic.
Yeah, since you like this is completely different topic, but I just wanted to quickly mention it since we have 5 minutes left, and you mentioned it. There is DRA meeting tomorrow, the DRA working group. So I cannot remember the official name. And
Already.
I think one of the topics where I've seen the discussions seem to be heading is figuring out next step after the 130 or 131 timeline, and in particular around scoring and preferences. And I think this is a topic where there is, or at least I see a risk of essentially a solution being selected that doesn't really work with autoscaling. I think either CAS or Carpenter, because I think it's very easy, and where I've seen people kind of going with the discussion to just say, okay, the DRA plugins will just have a scoring plugin, and that will influence the selection of hardware. And I think this is problematic because in autoscaled environment, essentially scheduler doesn't get to make any decisions. So scoring is in most cases just irrelevant, but the scoring plugin doesn't really extend to autoscaler because you're not scoring individual pods, right? You need at minimum some sort of, I want to score placement of all of those pods on all of those nodes as a unit to make a decision. I don't even know if that makes sense because that's still difficult. How do you combine this with spots, data, VM availability, all the other stuff that goes into autoscaling? So I think that's an interesting topic, and I'm worried that if we as a group don't get involved, it's just we're running the risk of community going the other way. That just doesn't work super well with autoscaling.
Yeah, I think to hopefully to quell your fears a little bit, like I've been attending the DRA working group meetings. I know a few people on the Carpenter maintainer team have been attending. And then like AWS in general, like I'm making sure AWS in general is aware of the fact that like the API meeting is happening tomorrow, because there are the working group meetings, but the meeting tomorrow, as I understand it, is like specifically around like API proposal and like thinking through some of the API specification. So I'm definitely attending, and I know that there'll be a number of people who will also be attending who are interested. So hopefully that helps, like, because we'll have enough people there that have relevant context to give feedback. I'm curious what your thoughts are on like some of the MIG stuff that they're talking about, because that also worries me a little bit when they're talking about like, okay, like the GPU could be configured in this way and it could be partitioned in these like 15 different ways that also are going, and then like choosing this way is going to then affect its ability to like be utilized, and that kind of combinatorial expansion kind of gets very complicated to reason. And I'm not actually sure how in practice how bad it gets, because I haven't seen like I know that there's a doc that Kevin wrote, but when the talk starts getting into like, and I know that there are use cases around it, but when the talk starts getting into like, okay, yeah, now there's like an instance type representation, and then that instance type has hardware, and I can pick any of the hardware, but then I can also pick from any of that hardware. Each of those individual pieces of hardware can have this number of like possible ways to be configured. That starts to look like very, very complicated in my mind. I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I agree. It does. We actually discussed this with Kuba earlier today, and I think we want to discuss it more before the meeting tomorrow, which we're also both planning to attend, I believe. But yeah, it is a bit scary. I think in practice, and I don't know that, right? This is just me making a guess. What we've seen in GK is a lot of people who run this sort of more complex use cases, at least today, would do this with like node selectors and like workload separation. So basically, workloads would target specific nodes, just because if you have a different sharing strategies, you don't want to kind of randomly mix and match. You want a specific one. And I think that if that happens, like basically as long as your pods have sort of homogeneous requirements, it's probably not that much of an issue. Intuitively to me, I don't know if Kuba agrees actually, but yeah, the moment you try to bin pack pods with like different requirements, it becomes very weird, because order of scheduling becomes important, right? If we configure the GPU based on first pod that lands there, and then just scheduling them in different order can result in very different configuration, which is definitely painful.
Yeah, like technically, I think, and again, I'm not sure. We've started discussing this today. I think it might affect things like caching, for example, because like for example in CAS we cache the results of like scheduling filters. So there's like a node times node per pod cache. And we like try that node first before looking for another one. Like things like that might not work depending, like if you have multiple pods depending on the order. But that, upon some discussion today, in practice that should be fine. And as Maciek mentioned, like there are certain setups that would result in the same behavior today, even with the current plugins. So I am now leaning more towards that. There's no technical reason to like mandate, for example. I like to try to steer the conversation away from this model. Like maybe we'll come up with something by tomorrow, but there's nothing like fundamentally incompatible with autoscaling about it. I think. But I was also very skeptical at first, though.
I think my one concern is if there's like, we already don't have control over the ordering of how these pods go onto nodes, that now if there's another dimension to like how they could
sort of the same though, because the control is still in the scheduler. Like that to me is more of a reason why it's not that different from today's status, because
well, it's different because I imagine that like the if there's even more dimensionality to like how the selection can happen, you can get into worse states.
I see. So it's like, okay, right now
So today you can have a scenario, right, where autoscaler provides not enough nodes. I mean, not one pod per node, but like in bin pack scenarios, we just bin pack better than scheduler do, for example, and we provide too few nodes, and then it should be eventually consistent, because you just get another provisioning until you eventually reach this.
I think what Jonathan,
yeah,
I think what Jonathan was saying is that this is right now in practice okay, because it's just the difference like in like which node the pod lands on, and it might get worse in practice because on top of that you also get the decision on how a node is configured, I guess.
Yeah, so I see this, and maybe I'm wrong. I see this as kind of, it's the same problem that on paper exists today, though I've actually never seen it in practice, kind of outside of someone engineering it manually to happen. But maybe if the probability with the new API just increases, it becomes an issue, right? So just because you can have it theoretically today, it
but I
really
don't-
matters what's the probability and how often it happens in practice.
Yeah, but I don't
Yeah.
think we can really predict that, right? In order to have like an informed discussion today, like tomorrow, about it.
Yeah, I think it's mostly like when you say like, okay, if this, I'm not exactly sure, so I don't I understand all the details, and I probably need to dig in a little bit better to like, okay, pod supports this like this different way of partitioning. Like, how does that influence the node's ability to like configure its own partitioning? How does the scheduler select which way it should be partitioned, or is it like the node's decision? And then
It's
from that,
so the selection, like the algorithm that the scheduler uses, should be like baked into the plugin. So like for
Yeah.
cast, that's easy because we just get that code and it should work the same way as the scheduler. I mean, the order still matters and can be different, resulting in potentially different results. But at least like given one pod, the algorithm should work the same. So it should pick the same partition given the same pod in the same order. As far as I understand it.
yeah, okay, yeah, I'm sure there'll be more discussion tomorrow. Those are my.
Is that something that maybe we want to discuss, let's say next week, based on, I don't know if anything happens, but that feels like there is a lot of discussion on this left. We could be discussing this for quite a bit more. So I don't know, would same time work for you next week? Do you think that's valuable?
Yeah, let's shoot for that. Sounds good. I think on our side, like I posted the issue. We put an issue last week to actually track some of the work, and I'm like crossing my fingers, hoping somebody will start building out a POC, because I don't think anyone on the maintainer team has the time right now. But I think there may be a few people in the community that are interested. So we'll see where that goes.
Yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're 5 minutes past time. I think we have some kind of clear action items and next steps on the provisioning request, and also topic for the next meeting. So I think that's a good point. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good
Thank you.
week. Bye.
See you.